2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
2NURFM 103.7. We are on Budget Eve morning, I guess, and a very, very interesting evening. It always is a budget time. Dr. Jim Jost, good morning this morning. Budget, what are your thoughts on what we can expect? A big test for the government tonight?
Yeah, good morning, Mark. I think you're right to say it's a big test for the government. Budgets are always a testing time anyway, but the past few years have not been good for the government. And I think this is the moment where Malcolm Turnbull really needs, as Prime Minister, to have a couple of big wins in the sense that he needs to stamp his authority over both his own party and the government in general, and to some extent the Parliament. And that's going to be the real test in terms of how Senate members, in particular the crossbench, respond to it. At the moment, they've been selectively leaking things, trying to drain off, if we can use the metaphor of, shall we say, something like a bit of poison, getting rid of the nasty stuff, trying to get that out into the public space, get the responses to it, and beginning to manage that before they actually bring down the details in the budget, so that when they actually do announce something that might be a little touchy, some of the sting has gone out of it. Now, at the moment, it appears that most of the things that they've released has basically not created too much of a furore. There has been a bit of negativity from some Senate members, some uncertainty, shall we say, where Senate members on the crossbench have sort of said, well, we're not sure yet, we'll wait and see, or we're not going to support that. I think Jackie Lambie's come out very strongly about higher education and is not supporting that. Pauline Hanson has sort of equivocated on a number of things, and I think that's sort of to be expected from the crossbench. But the government this time around has been wooing the crossbench a little more effectively, or at least assiduously, actually taking the time to talk with them before they actually announce their major measures, and trying to bring them on side. I don't know where Darren Hinch stands, for example, because he's been overseas, but he'll be another one that they'll be trying to get. But I think that the big test is, as you say, it's a big test, and the big issue is making sure that they sort of bring most of the crossbenchers on side.
It is interesting you mentioned getting the crossbenchers on side and creating some unity within their own party as well. Things that seem to have been lacking for quite a while under Malcolm Turnbull. But I guess with the Senate, it's always tricky. It's not like the glory days that John Howard had for a couple of years, where they had pretty much control of the Senate and could pretty much get most things through.
Well, I think that was a sort of rare moment in Australian politics, at least in the past sort of 40 or 50 years, where the government of the lower house has had control of the upper house. But I think for the past 4 years, the Turnbull and before that the Abbott governments were played pretty fast and loose with the Senate, and even within their own coalition there were areas of dissent, problems there which sort of skewed the way in which the budget was brought down. And I think in the first Abbott government, for example, the budget came down with a real crash, and it just crunched people all over the place. Really did political damage to the government. A government that actually had a pretty big stock of political capital, and then they squandered it. Now, Malcolm Turnbull also has had a problem with his own political capital, shall we say. So this budget is really, in some senses, a make or break. He needs to be able to, and Scott Morrison to some extent as Treasurer, they both need to have some successes. Whether that will happen, I think is an open question, because some of the issues are really can be really quite contentious. We'll hear a lot about the surplus, whether they can get the budget back into surplus. Most of that is political huff and puff, and in many respects not entirely to the point. The real issue is, what is the long-term political plan that the government has in mind about the direction of the Australian economy? What are the long-term things that the budget is going to be setting in place, rather than the short-term issues which seem to dominate the political cycle.
That is that is politics for you, though. It is always those short-term things that come up over and over again. Because you mentioned the Tony Abbott's government squandering that massive amount of political capital. That Joe Hockey cigar didn't help.
No.
On budget day.
It certainly didn't, and I think that the coalition has learned a few lessons since then, and they've been much more careful about how they've managed things. But they're still going down some of the predictable paths, the sort of the trade-off between welfare, shall we say. I wouldn't say punishing, that's probably too strong, but certainly taking stronger measures to curb spending on the welfare issues in order to pay for other areas of social policy. And there seems to be a fairly narrowly constrained way of understanding how infrastructure works and the need to build infrastructure. The government at present, and maybe the budget, will have a more positive and detailed set of visions, shall we say, for the next 3 to 5 years. But if the past is any guide, they tend to be very sort of constrained in the way they think about infrastructure, and without sort of opening up yet another area to talk about, the way in which the government has treated higher education, vocational education, and even schooling to some extent, indicates that they don't see that as a significant part of infrastructure. They see that as somehow a cost or a cost on government and a benefit for individuals, rather than seeing it in a more broader sense as part of the national infrastructure. That if you have a well-educated, relatively flexible society around the ability to think and the ability to make decisions and the ability to sort of shift from job and career quite agilely, as the Prime Minister would put it. Well, if you want that sort of capacity, then you need to invest in it and not see it as something that is simply a benefit for each individual. I think the Australian population as a whole, Mark, see that particular dimension, and they see that in other areas of social infrastructure as well. But it's interesting the degree of disconnect between the politicians on the one hand and what the wider population sees as important and a priority. Now, very quickly, it's quite the case that we in the wider population sometimes don't get the point, that we don't see the bigger picture because we don't have all the information. But to the extent that we do have some information, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between what governments think is appropriate infrastructure and what the wider population thinks.
And of course, they've got that ongoing battle as we all look at the budget and we all want to see that there's something in it for us, but that's obviously another question.
Can I just quickly add to that? It's interesting that while we do talk about the hip pocket nerve, and it is sensitive at times, when it comes to the big picture, most Australians regard the hip pocket nerve as not necessarily the prime mover. They will feel the pinch, but if they know that the pinch is actually helping them in the longer term, in particular helping their children's future, then there is a lot more willingness to endure a little bit of a pinch on the hip pocket, a little bit of pinching of that nerve, than there is, to just simply say, well, what's in it for me?
We will wait and wonder. It is the budget tonight. Jim Jost, I know you'll be down with the pizza and the chips and lollies, watching it with great interest tonight. I'm sure we'll follow up with you down the road.
Okay, no worries. Thanks, Mark.
To NURFM 103.7.